He was celebrated as a symbol of serenity and purity, but behind that calm that captivated millions lay the first sign of a tragedy that no one wanted to recognize. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damage, to see how the entertainment world works and how an icon is redefined. His rise in the industry seemed to herald a luminous story, guided by a silent order that many mistook for unshakable strength. The camera found in his face an almost spiritual harmony, a contained expression that suggested an uncommon emotional depth. His presence needed no stridency. A sustained gaze or a minimal gesture was enough to convey the impression that, beneath the surface, there existed a universe of calm that nothing could disturb. It was that very stillness that offered the public the illusion of a refuge, the seductive idea that there still existed artists capable of embodying a discreet nobility in an environment governed by haste, comparison, and constant ambition. With each appearance, his figure was consolidated as a point of balance on a stage saturated with tensions. Directors, castmates, and technicians described his meticulous courtesy, his way of gently bowing his head when greeting, his habit of memorizing the names of those who formed part of the team. These behaviors, apparently simple, began to weave around him a portrait of humanity that deeply moved those who had the opportunity to work by his side. However, that very humanity, so celebrated on the surface, would eventually become an uncomfortable element for the rigid structures that govern the industry, structures that rarely allow authenticity to flow without consequences. The serenity he projected was not an artifice. It came from years of silent discipline, from an intimate conviction that constant effort could sustain a dignified career even in the midst of a competitive system. He seemed to seek meaning rather than visibility. He wished to understand each scene more than to dominate it. Such idealism, so valuable for the interpretive art, began to inevitably clash with the impersonal logic of a sector that demands not only talent, but also availability to accept its hidden codes. That which distinguished him as a performer, little by little, began to situate him on the border of an invisible vulnerability. Without foreseeing it, that border became the antechamber of a silent conflict that would envelop him with implacable slowness. His calm, so admired by the public, would be interpreted in very different ways by those who operated behind the scenes. While his figure was consolidated on the screen, an unprecedented tension began to form around him, a tension so subtle that it barely left traces, but deep enough to insinuate that his story was heading toward uncertain territory. In that initial moment, when the light still seemed to protect him, the plot was already brewing, which, without his knowledge, would mark the course of everything that would come after. From his first steps in the industry, the figure of Yu Menglong seemed to walk on a delicate line separating hope from a vulnerability that no one imagined. His humble background, marked by days similar to one another, and by the silent conviction that disciplined work could open doors inaccessible to many, forged in him a sensibility that did not correspond to the implacable rhythm of the world he aspired to enter. He grew up without privileges, without surnames that resonated in casting rooms, or contacts capable of swaying decisions. His decision to dedicate himself to acting was born of an intimate, almost spiritual impulse, which guided him toward a purpose deeper than the search for fame. He had learned from a young age that the value of a life is not measured by the speed with which recognition is reached, but by the coherence with which one sustains that which is considered true. When he arrived in professional circles, his presence immediately caught attention. He had a way of listening that contrasted with the habitual urgency of young actors. He paused at every instruction, absorbed the studio atmosphere, and observed the work of the technical team with an almost ritualistic respect. His voice, measured and warm, revealed an inner serenity that some mistook for shyness. Directors saw in him a rare quality, the capacity to enter a character from an emotional, almost meditative understanding without resorting to exaggerated gestures or superficial artifices. This particularity made him a singular performer, capable of endowing simple scenes with unexpected depth. However, that which for some was a virtue, for others began to result uncomfortable. In an industry where technical skill shares the spotlight with the willingness to enter private circles, his reserved character awakened questions. The unwritten tradition of the sector was clear. The most coveted opportunities were not achieved solely with talent, but through participation in gatherings defined as essential, although it was rarely explained what they consisted of. Late dinners, impromptu meetings in hotels, discreet conversations where alliances were sealed, formed part of a social architecture that determined the rise of many. Constant presence in those spaces was interpreted as a sign of availability, an ambiguous concept that silently regulated the distribution of favors, recommendations, and contracts. Manglong understood that dynamic early on, but something inside him resisted adopting it. His refusal was not haughty or confrontational. It was simply an expression of personal coherence. He accepted invitations only when they had a clear professional purpose. He avoided commitments he considered empty. He preferred to return home rather than prolong conversations designed to measure his loyalty. His behavior was always polite but firm. He did not seek to challenge anyone. He only tried to protect a vital space he considered essential to maintain his integrity. The industry, accustomed to molding the silences of others, began to perceive that reserve as a form of intentional distance. Around him, interpretations arose that did not reflect reality. Some maintained that he believed himself superior to other actors. Others affirmed that he did not understand the rules of the game. Some, more severe, insinuated that his gestures of courtesy hid a mistrust toward those who could propel him. These perceptions, although unfounded, began to gain strength in private conversations where the opportunity to defend himself was rarely offered. In an environment where image precedes dialogue, assumptions transformed into arguments and arguments into decisions. The first indications of that transformation were discreet. A script that was supposed to arrive urgently took weeks to appear. A project that seemed assured was postponed without explanation. A director who had shown initial enthusiasm for working with him suddenly changed focus. It seemed like a cluster of casual circumstances, but their accumulation drew a disturbing pattern. The shine that previously illuminated his trajectory began to blur in almost imperceptible ways, as if a silent shadow had begun to slowly expand around his name. Despite this, Manglong continued to act with the same serenity. He trusted that time, together with his constant dedication, would reveal the transient nature of those obstacles. He did not mention his suspicions, nor did he seek culprits. He preferred to concentrate on the roles that still arrived, on the meticulous preparation of each scene, on the respectful treatment of those who shared the set with him. His silence was not a strategy. It was the only way he knew to remain faithful to himself. But that silence, which for him represented balance, began to be interpreted as a withdrawal. The people who once praised his discretion began to consider it a sign of uncomfortable resistance. The lack of presence in certain social spaces became, in the collective imagination of the sector, a gesture of silent disobedience. And in a system sustained by fragile balances, the mere perception of disobedience is enough to generate calculated reactions. The effects intensified over time. They were not direct confrontations, nor explicit comments, but a progressive erosion that undermined the stability of his career. Some colleagues avoided making eye contact. Certain producers reduced the frequency of their messages. Casual encounters became tense surfaces where words seemed chosen with caution. It was as if his simple presence recalled a conflict that no one dared to name, and which, nevertheless, everyone contributed to sustaining. One night, a close colleague asked him why he continued to reject certain invitations that many considered essential to advance. Manglong replied without drama, with that serenity that was almost his personal hallmark. He said, with a calm voice, that there existed places where the light was so intense that it ended up obscuring the essential. The phrase, as simple as it was profound, revealed that he perfectly understood the nature of the environment in which he worked, although he refused to allow that environment to define him completely. That response summarized a tension that had grown without noise. It was the tension between a man seeking to sustain his integrity and a system expecting absolute compliance. Everything that would happen later was already insinuated in that initial contrast, in that silent struggle where every decision began to draw the outline of a destiny that escaped his control more and more. What do you think of this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The crisis advancing in silence found its turning point in an episode that, in appearance, lacked importance. It all began with an anonymous post on a forum of little relevance, written with an ambiguous tone that did not accuse directly, but insinuated behaviors contradicting the image of serenity the public had associated with Yu Menglong. The message provided no proof or verifiable references. However, it contained the kind of insinuations that, in the contemporary digital ecosystem, function as inevitable detonators. In a matter of hours, that vague phrase transformed into an unstoppable current that flooded platforms, comments, and opinion spaces. The speed with which his name ascended the trending lists revealed the power accumulated by an audience eager for new stories. What was initially simple curiosity turned into suspicion, and suspicion, fed by constant repetition, ended up modeling a public perception that advanced without opposition. The logic of the digital environment required no evidence, only momentum. The more the post was shared, the more it acquired an air of verisimilitude that did not come from facts, but from the collective echo. Social networks began to fragment into two clearly defined camps. On one side, the followers who had accompanied his career since its beginnings firmly defended his reserved character, interpreting it as a sign of humility and coherence. For them, that rumor completely lacked foundation. On the other side, a growing group emerged that, moved by the constant need to identify culprits in every cycle of indignation, demanded immediate explanations. The absence of concrete information became, paradoxically, one more argument to reinforce suspicions. The lack of evidence did not weaken the rumor, it strengthened it. In parallel, certain fragments of old interviews reappeared in ceaseless loops. Brief pauses between answers, glances that at the time were interpreted as reflective, natural silences typical of his temperament were taken out of context and presented as indications of a supposed hidden arrogance. Isolated seconds were edited, backgrounds were darkened, his gestures were slowed down to accentuate a coldness that had never existed. The narrative no longer sought to understand, but to confirm a manufactured conclusion. Traditional media did not take long to intervene, attracted by the speed of the phenomenon. Entertainment programs dedicated entire segments to analyzing every detail of his behavior and past appearances. Columnists compared his case with figures who had fallen from grace years ago, establishing parallels that, although lacking direct relation, reinforced the sensation that Manglong was part of a recurring pattern. In this scenario, the story ceased to focus on verifiable facts and came to depend on interpretations molded by needs that had nothing to do with reality. During that process, his response was silence. He did not publish statements, did not offer declarations, did not seek to clarify what had happened. For some, that silence represented containment and prudence in a delicate moment. For others, it became a tacit admission. The dynamics of the digital environment transformed the absence of words into an open space where each spectator projected their conclusions, allowing the tale to advance without resistance. His silence, which in previous stages had been a sign of serenity, was now interpreted as a void that public opinion hastened to fill. The impact on his career was immediate and profound. The companies with which he had collaborated for years began to review their strategies. Some paused advertising campaigns, arguing they needed to evaluate the reputational risk. Others opted to distance themselves discreetly, reducing the visibility of the content in which he appeared. Digital platforms, through mechanisms as subtle as they were effective, decreased their recommendations to avoid controversies. Although none of this was communicated explicitly, the effect was clear. The system retreated, withdrawing its support without the need to pronounce any judgment. In the internal sphere of the industry, casting directors stopped mentioning his name in planning meetings. What was once a constant presence on consideration lists turned into a silent absence. There were no discussions, nor direct vetoes. They simply stopped including him. That strategy, as calculated as it was cold, demonstrated the sophistication of the mechanisms with which the industry manages its internal tensions. No one accused him, no one defended him openly, but everyone acted as if the outcome were already decided. Meanwhile, his followers tried to counteract the current of aggressive messages. However, their efforts were overwhelmed by the magnitude of the phenomenon. The public conversation became a chaotic space where unfounded hypotheses, hasty conclusions, and affirmations that heeded no verification coexisted. The truth became a secondary piece, displaced by the speed with which narratives were formed and disseminated. In the midst of this whirlwind, Manglong continued to appear in public with the same composure that had always characterized him. His tranquil expression, far from protecting him, began to be perceived by some as part of the problem. His serenity, which had awakened so much admiration at the beginning, began to acquire a tragic nuance. Those who observed him closely perceived a new weariness in his gaze, a shadow that seemed to extend more and more. It was not the image of a man oblivious to what was happening, but that of someone who understood, with growing pain, that he had lost control of his own story. The media avalanche that had been unleashed was not an isolated accident. It was the accumulated result of tensions that had been forming in silence for some time, tensions that found in a baseless rumor the spark they needed to explode. Manglong's case evidenced the fragility of any public figure in an environment where perception can modify reality and where repetition can transform into a verdict. The story was ceasing to belong to him, absorbed by a system that grants no space for nuances. Everything that would come after was already insinuated in the echo of that first anonymous accusation, in the speed with which the public adopted contradictory versions, and in the way the industry withdrew its support without uttering a word. The storm had not reached its end point. It had simply revealed the force of the wind that was beginning to drag him toward a deeper darkness. The darkest stage of Yu Menglong's life began at the precise moment when the media noise started to dissipate. The intensity of the scandal gave way to a different silence, a silence that offered no relief, but an absence that embraced him with a coldness he had never experienced. When public attention shifted toward new controversies, Manglong remained suspended in an intermediate space, where he was no longer the subject of debate, but neither did he recover the stability he once held with serenity. It was as if he were trapped in the echo of a rumble that continued vibrating only inside him. Projects that had been planned months in advance disappeared without announcement. Producers who previously insisted on collaborating avoided him with distant courtesy. Confirmed meetings were cancelled via brief apologies sent by assistants who barely knew him. The calls that used to mark the rhythm of his professional agenda were interrupted abruptly, replaced by a stillness that became heavier with each passing day. That succession of cancellations, initially interpreted as an inevitable effect of the controversy, ended up becoming the reflection of a more painful reality. The system had decided to dispense with him without the need to declare it openly. Those who visited him during those days described an atmosphere that did not belong to failure, but to a form of deep weariness that settled in the smallest gestures. There was no rage in his words, nor attempts to justify what had happened. What predominated was a disconcerting serenity, as if he understood that his trajectory had remained in the hands of forces he could not control. He continued offering signs of gratitude for every gesture, every conversation, every unexpected visit. However, behind that persistent kindness hid an almost imperceptible delay in his gaze, a shine that seemed to weaken without announcing its disappearance. Through brief conversations, shared only with those who formed part of his most intimate circle, reflections emerged that he had kept hidden until then. One of those phrases became emblematic for those who witnessed that critical moment. He said that there existed two types of fame, one that liberates and another that takes ownership of the one who holds it. He did not express it with bitterness, but with a clarity demonstrating the depth of his thoughts. For him, fame had ceased to be an opportunity to expand his art, and had transformed into a structure conditioning every movement, every silence, every appearance. The emotional deterioration intensified when he understood that his silence, previously interpreted as prudence, had become an argument used to mold someone else's narrative. At no moment did he pronounce himself regarding his innocence or guilt, because he never considered that the nature of the rumors deserved an explanation. However, he observed how public opinion transformed his absence of declarations into assumptions, into interpretations advancing without a break. From then on, a sensation of dispossession installed itself in him, the conviction that his story was beginning to belong more to the gaze of others than to his own voice. With the passing of the days, the silent pressure surrounding him became harder to bear. He stopped receiving invitations to events, his appearances became increasingly scarce, and his public presence began to reduce to images taken from afar, where he was seen walking with slow steps, as if every displacement demanded an additional effort. His followers noticed a change in his countenance. The photographs that previously transmitted serenity now showed a weariness that could not be disguised, a kind of vulnerability resonating strongly among those who had once admired him for his calm. The most critical point arrived when the news of his death spread with a speed that contrasted painfully with the silence that had marked his final months. The initial shock gave way to a wave of questions, interpretations, and messages of disbelief. Many resisted accepting that someone who radiated such stillness could have faced such severe deterioration without the public perceiving it. Others revisited his previous works, seeking in his interpretations signs that had gone unnoticed. In his glances, they found nuances that now acquired a different meaning, as if each scene had revealed inadvertently a fragment of his inner struggle. Manglong's death not only rekindled interest in his career, but triggered a collective process of reinterpretation. There was talk of the extreme pressure artists face, of the emotional fragility that often remains hidden behind apparent perfection, of the responsibility falling on those who consume and disseminate narratives without questioning them. His case became a reference point to analyze the control mechanisms operating in highly competitive industries, where perception carries as much weight as reality. While spontaneous tributes multiplied, debates emerged in specialized forums and academic spaces. Not only was his trajectory discussed, but also the structural tensions that had allowed his figure to vanish without opposition. It was no longer asked what he had done to cause his downfall, but what conditions had allowed a respected performer to end up trapped in devastating isolation. In that change of focus resided a kind of late justice, a deeper understanding of what he had truly faced. The legacy of Yu Menglong began to redefine itself then with a different light. His final silence, previously questioned, began to be understood as an act of personal coherence. The serenity he maintained until the last moment ceased to be interpreted as passivity and became a reminder that dignity can be sustained even amidst unbearable pressures. His story, far from being reduced to a controversial episode, acquired a universal dimension, the tension between the need to remain faithful to oneself and the demand to adjust to a system that rarely allows for nuances. His name, evoking a calm that now seemed tinged with melancholy, continued resonating among those who found in his trajectory a symbol of humanity confronted with an implacable environment. And in that persistent echo, something deeper was revealed, that his presence, although fragile before the machinery of fame, left a mark that would continue inviting reflection on truth, social pressure, and personal preservation. The impact of the life and farewell of Yu Menglong began to settle slowly, far from the bustle that once defined his fall. When the noise disappeared, a quieter memory remained, built not by ephemeral headlines, but by the intimate trace he left on those who observed him throughout his career. With the passing of months, his name reappeared in discreet conversations, not as part of a scandal, but as the reminder of a trajectory marked by sensitivity and integrity. His absence forced many to reconsider not only the way artists are observed, but also the weight we place on figures who, although visible, remain vulnerable. In different corners of the industry, reflections began to emerge regarding the role external pressures play in the emotional life of those under constant scrutiny. Producers who rarely stopped to think about it mentioned the need to create spaces where performers could express doubts or weariness without fear of being excluded. Young actors found in his story a forceful reminder. Visibility offers opportunities, but also demands a strength not everyone can sustain without support. The conversation ceased to center on the controversy surrounding his final months and shifted toward broader questions about collective responsibility and empathy. The followers who went back to review his work discovered details that had previously gone unnoticed. In his glances, they found a sensitivity that seemed to anticipate a silent struggle, as if every gesture hid nuances that only now could be understood. His interpretations acquired a renewed depth, illuminated by an understanding that arrived too late to alleviate the weight he carried in life. This process of reinterpretation did not seek to idealize him or turn him into a symbol of sacrifice, but to restore the complexity of someone who faced tensions exceeding the public image constructed around him. The public conversation extended beyond his particular case and opened debates on the speed with which collective judgments are formed, the ease with which rumors go viral, and the effect these have on those who, from their visible position, are exposed to interpretations that rarely consider their humanity. There was talk of the urgency to question the culture glorifying total exposure and demanding immediate answers even when silence is the only form of self-protection. In this sense, Manglong's story acquired a pedagogical value transcending his own trajectory, inviting a rethinking of the dynamics of an environment saturated with expectations and contradictions. His legacy, far from being reduced to tragedy, began to be defined as a reminder of the importance of personal coherence. The serenity he maintained until the end was not a sign of passivity, but the expression of a deep commitment to his identity. In a scenario where adaptability is considered an absolute virtue, his insistence on remaining faithful to his principles revealed a type of courage that rarely receives recognition. His story allowed for the understanding that dignity can be sustained even on the most fragile margins of fame. The future of his memory does not belong to the scandal that once enveloped him, but to those who find in his journey an invitation to observe with greater compassion those who transit the complex territory of public exposure. His presence continues resonating, not as a painful echo, but as a call to value authenticity even when it turns out to be vulnerable. In that silent space, his name continues breathing. If you wish for us to delve into another story or explore a hidden chapter of the entertainment world, leave your question in the comments.